Stories from the Growing Years by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 7. The Logging Years. The logging industry was booming in North Branch the year that Philip Hale arrived to work on Thomas's surveying crew. Jerome had secured several thousand more acres of virgin timber in addition to what Augusta had sold him a number of years before. Thomas had been hired to begin work on the harvesting and platting of the original acres. He began to recruit additional help as more timber was acquired by the lumber mill.
"Where's the new man coming from?"
Sarah Jane asked when Thomas announced that Philip Hale would be arriving. "At the moment, he's in Chicago," Thomas answered, "but according to his application, he comes from the East Coast. He is highly recommended by a surveying company in Maine." Philip immediately began to make himself indispensable to Jerome and Thomas. "He has to be the best cruiser I've ever worked with," Thomas remarked one evening as we sat at supper.
"Cruiser?" I asked. "Is that what you call him? I thought he was a surveyor."
"He is," Thomas replied. "Cruiser is the name for the special job he does. Someone has to figure out how many board feet of lumber a designated plat will yield. Some of the areas the mill owns won't give us enough lumber to pay for harvesting. Those acres are platted and developed for farmland. A good cruiser can divide the plat so we get the highest yield."
"Something tells me that a job like that would require a lot of math,"
Sarah Jane remarked.
"I'm glad it's not my responsibility. Mabel would like it."
Thomas nodded. "It takes math all right, but you also have to be able to climb trees."
"I've always been a first-class tree climber," I said. "I had torn clothes and a broken arm to prove it. But how does climbing a tree help you to measure it?"
"You'll have to ask Philip about that," Thomas laughed. "I don't know all his secrets." It didn't take Philip Hale very long to discover that Elizabeth Lawton worked in the lumber mill office. He would arrange to bring his weekly reports to Jerome in time so that he could spend a few minutes with Elizabeth talking about business. As the weeks passed, the time increased, and the business included personal matters. Since Philip spent the work week back in the woods, his weekends at Rebecca Handy's boarding house were devoted to becoming better acquainted with Elizabeth. This, of course, did not pass unnoticed by the general population of North Branch. "Philip seems like such a nice young man," Myra Grayson observed. "He couldn't find a nicer young lady than Elizabeth. Maybe we should try to help that friendship along a little."
"I think the girl ought to use a little more sense than she usually shows," Gladys sniffed. "We don't know anything about this fellow except what appears on the surface. Takes more than wavy hair and a nice smile to make a good marriage."
"That's true," Augusta said. "But Philip has a lot of people to vouch for him. There's not a lot he could get away with in a town like this without everyone hearing about it. North Branch has the best communication system in the state."
"I can vouch for that," Colleen put in. "If I had time to stay on the switchboard all day and listen in, I could write a contemporary history of this town."
She glanced mischievously at Gladys.
"Don't look at me," Gladys bristled. "I don't hear any more than the rest of you do."
"The wicked flee when no man pursueth," Sarah Jane quoted. "No one is accusing you, Gladys, but none of us has heard anything against Philip, have we?"
We agreed that we had not, and when Philip began accompanying Elizabeth to church and social affairs, everyone happily accepted him as a member of the community. One afternoon, in late summer, a group of us gathered by the river for a picnic. It had been warm during the day, but the early evening breeze carried a hint of fall. "It won't be long until the winter camps are set up," Jerome commented. "Thomas and his crew have been working hard all summer."
"Now is the time to find out Philip's secrets," Sarah Jane said. "There are some things we want to know about you, Philip."
Philip looked startled and Elizabeth confused. "What secrets?" she asked. "How do you know there are any?" "You needn't worry," Len assured them. "We were talking one evening about your job as a cruiser. We wondered how you go about predicting the amount of lumber a plot will yield." Philip seemed relieved. "There's no secret about that," he said. "When I go into a new area, I climb the highest tree I can find. From there, I can see over the whole plot and judge about how many trees, their height and girth, and how many board feet they'll probably give. Having been at it a few years, I find I'm fairly accurate in my estimates, he concluded modestly. You certainly are, Thomas agreed. Actually, the cruiser isn't responsible for the final figures. We have scalers who use a tool called a cheat stick to calculate board feet.
They must have some kind of formula to use, Sarah Jane said. What is it?
After the shanty boys fell the trees and the choppers top them and trim the branches, the sawyer cuts them into 16-foot logs. We figure a log 16 inches in diameter will yield 144 board feet of lumber. A log 44 inches around will give us 1,600 board feet. So, you see, my job isn't as hard as it sounds, Philip concluded, especially here where the land has already been purchased.
If you say so, Sarah Jane replied, but it still sounds complicated to me. What would you do if the land hadn't been bought?
Back in Maine, most cruisers worked independently. We looked at maps in the land offices and found what areas were available. We'd look the trees over, enter the land we wanted, and then offer it to a lumber company for purchase. There's a lot of speculation in a deal like that. If you thought you had an exceptional area, the company might pay the cruiser $8 an acre finder's fee. If you underestimated, they probably wouldn't work with you again. I learned in a hurry that it paid to be accurate. Later at home, Len and I recalled the conversation. Jerome has told me that he intends to pull Philip from Thomas's crew this fall, Len said. They have the areas pretty well marked for the winter's work, and he needs a good man to go up the river and secure new timber. The business is getting so big that Jerome can't handle the searching any longer. Len was thoughtful for a moment. Do you realize how wealthy we would be if I had accepted the partnership when he offered it to me?
I don't even want to hear about it, I said. You know that's not the kind of wealth I'm interested in. Our lives serving the Lord are as rich as anyone needs to be. Do you wish you'd made another choice?
No. If the decision had to be made again, it would be the same. God's work is my responsibility, and I'm content with it. True to his promise, Jerome offered Philip the opportunity to work as a purchasing agent for the mill. Elizabeth was delighted.
That means that Philip will be able to live in town all week long, she said. I can see him every day instead of just on weekends. And, she added happily, Philip says he can now afford to ask me to marry him. Jerome will pay him in cash or buy a share of land he identifies for purchase. Philip will keep an eye out for a good place for our home and take that in shares. Then the rest that he finds will be in money. Isn't that wonderful?
We agreed that it was, but Sarah Jane had a warning.
Don't let him get so far back into the hinterland to choose your property that we never see you again. Those woods are dense.
Don't worry, Elizabeth laughed. He'll stay close to the river. For one thing, he isn't going to want to hack a road back there too far.
As winter set in, business boomed in North Branch. Camps were set up and new families were moved into the village. When the harvesting began, the swampers blazed and cut tote roads to the river. Dorcas Gage reported on the increased activity at the store. I know logging is heavy work, she said, but I can't believe the amount of food those men put away in a week. Look at the shopping list the cook brought yesterday. We gathered around and gasped over the quantities that were ordered. 6 barrels of flour, 5 barrels of beef and pork, 8 bushels of potatoes, 3 bushels of onions, 1 barrel of sugar, 16 pounds of coffee, 5 pounds of tea, 50 pounds of butter. That doesn't even include things like pickles, lard, sausage, molasses, or fruit, Dorcas said.
Do you mean they can eat all of that in a week? Colleen asked. How do they have time to do anything to the trees?
A walk along the river in either direction from the mill showed that the men found time between meals to do a lot of work. Loaders and deckers used large cant hooks to pile logs 25 feet high on sleighs. Teams of 8 horses hauled the loads to the banking grounds along the river where the logs awaited the spring thaw to be floated to the lumber mill. The season for harvesting is only about 180 days, Thomas told us. But they average 20 logs per day. That adds up to a lot of lumber. In January, Elizabeth joined us one Sunday after church. Philip has found the section he's going to take for a share of our house, she said excitedly. I haven't seen it yet, but he says it's the most beautiful stand of timber he's seen here. We can hardly wait for the sale to go through. Jerome confirmed Elizabeth's report. I was sitting in my office Friday when Philip came in with the latest entries he has made for us. It looks like a record buy for the company. I think I made a wise move in giving that young man a free hand. We had an exciting day, Elizabeth said. While Philip was there, the foreman came in and said that they had just felled the largest hemlock he's ever seen. If his estimate is correct, it could be the biggest ever cut in Michigan.
I hope you aren't planning to chop it into 16-foot lengths, Sarah Jane exclaimed. It deserves to be on display as something other than a barrel stave or a porch railing.
That's exactly what I said, Myra Grayson declared. It needs to be where the most people can see it.
Lorenzo Handy came up with the perfect suggestion. Put it on the rail card and send it to the World's Fair exhibit in Chicago. They've probably never seen a tree as tall as some of their buildings. Sensible idea, Augusta said. Jerome, did that tree come off one of my acres? I think it did, Augusta. Is that what you'd like done with it? It sure is. When the fair's over, it can come back and be used for something special in North Branch. Even Gladys didn't disagree with that plan, Sarah Jane commented as we turned for home. Do you get the feeling that there might be something wrong with it if Gladys likes it?
It is a bit out of character,
I said as I lifted Alma into the sleigh.
But maybe even Gladys recognizes a good thing when she sees it. Or maybe she just hasn't marshaled an argument yet.
A couple of weeks later, Sarah Jane had some friends at their home for supper. The Graysons, Lorenzo and Colleen, and Len and I gathered around the table.
I thought you said that Elizabeth and Philip were coming,
I said to Sarah Jane. Philip is busy tonight, she replied. She glanced uneasily at Jerome.
And Elizabeth is watching the switchboard for me, Colleen put in.
That thing is as much worry as a baby. You can't take it with you when you go out, and you can't leave it alone. Rebecca will do it in an emergency, but it makes her nervous. Elizabeth offered to do it since Philip couldn't come to supper.
I opened my mouth to ask what Philip could be doing at night, but Jerome anticipated the question. You might as well know, he said. We have a problem that I wasn't expecting. It seems that the stand of timber that Philip wanted in shares was never reported in our office. It often happens that a cruiser will hold back a good find, then return and purchase it for himself. The temptation to do that is pretty great, and it isn't exactly illegal. It simply means that your employee is less than loyal to the company, and that's disturbing. I can't believe Philip would do that, Sarah Jane exclaimed. What does he say about it? He insists that he left all his reports, including that one, on Elizabeth's desk. We've searched everywhere, and so far there's no sign of it. Philip had entered the claim on the land office just as he did the other plots. I wouldn't feel so bad about his claiming the land if he'd admitted it. It's the possibility of dishonesty that disturbs me. The following day, Sarah Jane and I visited Elizabeth at the office.
I can't marry a man who isn't truthful, Elizabeth said tearfully. It's just as Gladys said. What do we know about Philip? He came here a total stranger, and I've never met any of his family. I don't want to distrust him, but what can I do?
You can trust him until it's proven that he is at fault, Sarah Jane said briskly. I don't believe that there's anything underhanded about Philip. We've prayed about this, so now let's get to work on it. When did he bring the reports in?
2 weeks ago Friday, Elizabeth replied. I remember because it was the same time the foreman came to tell us about the hemlock. It was windy, and when he opened the door, everything blew off my desk. All of us were picking up papers in here. It was a mess.
There, you see? How can you be sure you got them all? That report could have been overlooked.
There was nothing left on the floor, Elizabeth insisted. Where else could it have gone?
We looked around the room. Besides the desk and chairs, there was only a bookcase and a small table for furnishings. A search of the bookcase revealed no concealed paper.
Lorenzo, I said. Doesn't he clean in here? Maybe he picked it up with the trash.
But 2 weeks ago? How would we find it now? Elizabeth said. Why doesn't Philip file another report? Sarah Jane wondered. He could assume that the first one had been lost. Elizabeth shook her head. I suggested that to him, but he says it's a matter of honor. His name is on all the claims until he offers them to the company for purchase, and he won't have Jerome suspecting that he withheld one, then made it up when he was found out. Lorenzo's the best chance we have. The thought had been inspired, we agreed, when Lorenzo revealed that he bailed papers from the mill rather than burning them and was willing to search for the missing document. Of course, it was found, and Philip cheerfully declared that he didn't blame anyone for what had happened. I understand how it looked, he said. There's a lot of unscrupulous cruisers who have made their fortunes at the expense of their companies. I'm just glad we straightened it out before it ruined my life. What would I do without Elizabeth?
End of Chapter 7.